Hey friends, my name's Georgie. It is such a joy to welcome you to the Just Breathe podcast, where I'll be talking all things breathing to help empower you guys to use the power of your breath to harness your bodies and minds. In today's powerful conversation, I'll be chatting with Wintergreen, who is both a Buteyko method and Oxygen Advantage breathwork instructor, as well as a naturopath, the founder and director of the Common Knowledge Trust, as well as a developer of the Birthing Better skills. Wintergreen has worked with hundreds of fathers and mothers over the years to help them develop the skills to better cope with the process of being pregnant and giving birth. In today's episode, we dive deep into the topic of birth breathing and how having a set of skills can help women to cope, manage and feel in control of their birth experience, no matter where their birth occurs, who is present, the personal circumstances, or what happens and to the birthing woman during her birth. Wintergreen hopes that using these skills, women will look back on their baby's birth with pride and empowerment. And it really was such an incredibly moving and powerful conversation. Wintergreen's expertise are second to none, and I am in awe of her many years of experience in the health and wellness sector. Little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't already, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Just Breathe podcast. Let's keep on building our strong breathing community. The more people talking about breathing, the better. All right, let's jump right into today's powerful conversation. Whether or not you are pregnant or have ever been pregnant, anyone who identifies as human can learn something from this conversation, and I hope you take away as many insights as I did. This is episode 28 of Just Breathe with Wintergreen. So, birth breathing, where do we even start?
Well, I mean, that's a good question because you and I met through sort of the Oxygen Advantage, Buteyko groups, and you were interested in sort of Patrick, who was trained with Buteyko and has developed Oxygen Advantage, which is simulation of high altitude breath training for people who are not breathless. And he somehow has gotten involved in women's menstrual cycles, which is sort of like, oh, okay. And you had read his manuscript before his book was published, and he has a whole...
The Breathing Cure, which is now published. There's a whole section in there on women's health, which I must say I'm really pleased about, because just bringing more attention to women's health and acknowledging the fact that females are different from males physiologically, and so they're going to breathe slightly differently. So, yeah.
Right, which at some point people are going to discover that men have cycles as well.
Yeah, of course.
During that period of menopause.
Yeah.
Has the word men in it. And they do change.
Oh no, of course, but of course it's just not as predominant, I suppose, as the female cycle.
Yeah, and I had gotten involved in childbirth in the early 1970s, and our trust, Common Knowledge, puts out all the Birthing Better skills that hundreds of fathers and mothers developed. And it really started back then because the cesarean rate in the US then was 4.5%, which meant, and a lot of people go, oh, well, we can all do that, right? But people have to remember that first of all, without cesareans, 100% of pregnant women labor and have a vaginal birth. And what that means is some of us labor for hours and some labor for days.
Wow.
Some women cope, some women suffer terribly. Risks were considered to be normal, natural, and physiological, and tragedies were considered sad but acceptable. So, most women had a good outcome, and some women had tragedies, and in between, many had problems that got resolved in the modern health system. So when the natural birth movement touts a low cesarean rate, they have to understand that the labor part and the delivery part was not pleasant for most women. In fact, we've all heard the expression, women suffered in childbirth. And that didn't mean they had a poor outcome. It meant they didn't have the skills to cope with the natural, normal physiological pain or labor contractions because we can't control them, right? So at that point in 1970, Lamaze, the Bradley method, and in New Zealand, where I live, Grantley Dick Reed, were three obstetricians who had developed these breathing relaxation skills and to some degree an attitude belief, but they focused on low risk women with the assumption that low risk women would not suffer in childbirth and they would have a good outcome, right?
But so it would just be plain sailing, right?
Right, they're just plain sailing, right? So they had three, defined goals for low-risk women that if you used Lamaze or Bradley or Grantley Dick Reed breathing and relaxation, which were slightly different, you'd have a natural birth, which nobody ever had defined, nobody really defined that word. You'd have a pain-free labor, which is a stretch of anyone's imagination, and you do all of that without medical interventions.
Oh my goodness.
But the word interventions really wasn't used at that point. It was medical assessments, medical monitoring, medical procedures that in the 1980s all came under this word intervention. So I use Lamaze because Lamaze and Bradley in the US, where I gave birth in 1970, were the first ever childbirth preparation classes ever taught worldwide.
Wow.
So in the US, from the 60s to the 70s, there was a very high societal expectation that all, pregnant modern women would have a childbirth preparation class. And it was 6 weeks, 3 hours a week, all breathing and relaxation, all skills-based, because we were following our doctor's orders in the US. US was a bit unique because there were no midwives, unlike in your country. Midwives were always there. Home birth was always available for people. That's true in all of the Commonwealth countries. The US, everybody had been brought into the hospital. There were no midwives. People were still having home births, but it wasn't, every state was different. So we were attending these classes, and in some ways, the US was unique because you only really had one system throughout the whole country. And so we had the societal expectation that we all take these childbirth preparation classes. And in New Zealand, at the same time, that wasn't what was happening. What was happening in New Zealand with Grantley Dick Reed was that doctors assessed whether you were low risk. And then if you were low risk, they gave you a prescription to attend a childbirth class that was focused on achieving a natural birth, pain-free labor, because Grantley Dick Reed was childbirth without fear, and very little medical care, sort of a hands-off approach.
Right.
But what happened was not enough women had achieved those goals. And I'm honestly, the two places that they sort of blew it was the idea of pain-free labor. I mean, that was, because if women said, okay, I'm going to learn these things and I'm not going to feel pain, and then you feel pain, then you tend to stop doing what you learned.
Right.
So Lamaze breathing was impractical. It was
yes, that's what I would associate with. If you asked me what I thought would be in one of those classes, I'd straight away go, that's what you see on all, I've only known from films and TV shows, or, even from parental associations. But of course, having never experienced it myself, I just go on presumptions, and that's what I think of.
Right. And that was impractical. Everybody hyperventilated, and you ended up half of your labor breathing into a brown paper bag. And the Bradley was in the nose, out the mouth.
Right.
And when I started to work with families in the 70s, it was the mothers, the other women and the men who were saying, those skills sort of worked or they didn't work, and why didn't they? And it was complicated because it was partly, I have no medical training, but I worked with medically high risk families. So a lot of them didn't really get into the learning the skills because it was clear we were being told in class, these are for low risk women, and they don't work if you are induced. They don't work if you are augmented, right? So we learned the skills, but some of us quite half-heartedly because we didn't feel that they applied to our birth. So when the families that I started to work with, so for 10 years, we developed better coping skills, and one of them was breathing. And when Patrick was developing this book on the breathing cure, I had a conversation with him about birth breathing because someone had asked a question on the forum, can you use this type of breathing in labor? Right? To which I've been in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of births, and there are some women who just, you never hear them breathe. They basically go through labor with their eyes closed, very concentrated. And the only way that you know they're having a contraction is you see their eyes begin to REM, right?
Wow, right. Rapid eye movement, yeah.
Rapid eye movement, but that's not true for most women, right? Why men were so important in developing these breathing skills are two reasons. One is what we talked about before we recorded, is that men and women have a different physiology. Yes, kind of, and no, kind of.
Right.
We all blink, we all cough, we can all tighten up our rectum.
Yeah.
We all breathe the same way, we all use the variations the same way, but there's this thing about breathlessness as well, right? So, and men hear and see how women are responding, whereas women are experiencing it.
Yes.
So what fathers could tell was she sounds stressed when right. And because labor contractions are so variable, it's nanosecond to nanosecond that women change how they react to the intensity that they're feeling, and also can react to what somebody wants to do to them or what's around them and stuff like that. So and at that point, because the cesarean rate was so low, we weren't doing anything about trying to prevent cesareans, which we started to do in the 80s. And this was not a group of people who got together to natter this out. This was just my working with families, and we were faced with individual situations. And when we found skills that worked for one person, I'd pass them on to someone else. And once we got a handle on that this was universal, it didn't mean that they all worked in the same way. It meant that people understood them. They'd have a, yep, right, got it. That's kind of a response. Then in the 80s, we knew from our experience that even if we coped well, that many of us had long first stage as dilation phase, or long second stage, which is the delivery phase. And those phases by the 80s tended to elicit increased medical assessments, monitoring procedures, because this is where the medical profession, women don't want to suffer.
Right.
They don't on those, right? And because cesareans then became this bikini cut, because we were wearing bikinis and were demanding not to be left with this ugly scar, cesareans became safer. And because we're modern people that don't want to accept risks, we were more likely, if we had a risk, to be comfortable with a cesarean delivery if that cesarean delivery reduced the risk. And this becomes very political. This becomes very big. However, you can still use skills because you're still doing the activity, your birthing your baby.
Right.
And even if you're using breathing and relaxation skills. So if we start with Lamaze, which was, that was impractical.
Panting.
We knew that.
Yeah.
No, you couldn't do that for a long period of time. Bradley was more complicated because it said you breathe in your nose and out your mouth, to which we then started to talk about, from a guy's viewpoint, what did that look and sound like? And so what men were saying is sometimes I could see my partner do this, or I could see my partner do this. And she looked and sounded as though she was coping well.
Right.
Then there were times that I saw my partner do this. And then there were times I saw my partner do this.
Right.
And the guys would say, but she's still breathing in her nose and out her mouth.
Oh, right.
Right. And then at that point, we began to ask broader questions. If we want to have universal skills, because 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, then we had to stop and think and experience. So what we eventually came up with was that a question that I've asked people for years, okay? And that is, what are the 4 ways that humans breathe? To which, when I ask that, I can be asking doctors, midwives, doulas, pregnant families, athletes, anybody. And people go, and when they pause, we know that pause means they don't know. Right. And some people will say in your chest or in your belly or fast or slow. And some people kind of get it in your nose or your mouth or something like that. So what it is we breathe in and out our nose, which is what Buteyko and Oxygen Advantage is doing, right? Or we can breathe in our nose, out our mouth, and that's a conversation in Oxygen Advantage at high level of athletics. Can I exhale out my mouth, or do I have to keep breathing in and out my nose? Yeah. Or we can breathe in our mouth and out our nose, or we can breathe in and out our mouth. Yeah. Right. And that's where people with asthma and other, when we're working with all of this breathing stuff, is many people are mouth breathers. Right. And so when again, everybody goes, oh, well, I knew that. Well, you do know that, but you didn't know that. You didn't make the connection, perhaps. You did not make the connection. So then you ask the next question, which is, when we're living life, when are we breathing in the nose and out our mouth? And it's the same pause, right? It's just like you're doing. It's your thinking where you're going through, and you're very savvy about it. You're thinking, okay, what are they? So I showed 2, right? I'm thinking in times of stress. If I'm like, oh, in a time, that's when that's the first thing that'll come to my mind, I think. Right, that's one, right? So we then had to find all the variations. Right. The variations were blowing, and women in labor will often blow and count. Sometimes they do a sigh, exhale, jaw. Yeah. Yeah. Right. When we're exercising, and that's that question. Yeah, depending. When we go faster, do we have to breathe more deeply? Now that's a question. Yeah, we do that when we have sex. Yeah. We do it when we moan, which I showed you, or scream. Yeah. Right. So these are variations. So what we're really asking in birth, if you're dealing with really intense pain, is which of those variations indicate that you are coping, and which ones indicate that you're not coping. So this is a question of awareness. Well, you're not coping. It hurts like a mother, and you. Of course, but are you talking as well about the awareness of the guy as well, of the partner or the female, whoever, obviously, of course. Right. The awareness is the ability to choose when you're having this experience. So I'm not going to jump there, because that's really what you said, even though I don't think you were fully aware of how important it was, is how rapidly are women choosing what they're doing when they're in labor, right? And so when women describe labor, we describe it very simply. At the beginning of labor, the contractions didn't hurt, right? And I was able to go about my business. And then they got more intense. And while I was having a contraction, I had to stop doing what I was doing, but I could go about my business. Then the labor contractions get more intense. I don't want to do anything. Then they get really, really intense and it's hard to cope. Then they get beyond coping and then I lose the plot. And of course, that's when women in the medical profession are going to want to use pain relief, right? It's because the contractions become unbearable. That's what suffering in labor is.
So are you saying that the skills can replace the medication?
Well, that's a choice.
Right. Or they can accompany it as well?
That they can, yes, they can. So, but it's a choice. So the choice, when we started to develop these breathing skills, that's not how men were seeing contractions.
Right.
So women were defining a contraction as a thing that was either not painful, sort of painful, a little bit painful, terribly painful, unbearably painful. Right. So they were using the word contraction as though it was an entity, a one thing. Right. But men weren't seeing that. Right. What they were seeing was the contraction starts, it gets more intense, builds, it has a peak, it begins to go away, and then it goes away. Right. So women were experiencing that as a one thing, and men were experiencing as 5 phases. Right. So when men could articulate this, and it's hard for men to articulate in such a women-loaded area called childbirth, right? So when men were saying, that's not what I'm seeing, that's not what I'm hearing. So women weren't screaming at the start of a contraction. They weren't moaning at the beginning of it going up, so it was when it got really intense that their breathing started to really change. So what we had to do was understand of the 4 ways we breathe: in the nose, out the nose, in the nose, out the mouth, in the mouth, out the nose, in and out the mouth, and all of the variations, that we had to experience those variations in ourselves as women so that we could say, well, if I'm in between a contraction, I just would normally be breathing in and out my nose, right? So I'm just breathing in and out my nose. So when a contraction starts, am I still able to do that? And at the beginning, I was saying there are some women, they just eye motion, but they're very quiet in their breathing. They're nose breathing. Not for most women, but most women in that start a contraction will have been nose breathing because they're in between contractions, nothing's happening. So they just go back to nose breathing. And you don't hear them, or sometimes they talk, sometimes they're sleeping or resting. But when a contraction starts, a woman then is in a choice. If she's gone through and she realizes nose breathing can be very quiet, or it can be you might see as it starts and it begins to peak up, a woman using deeper nose breathing and then switching over to
using the skills to better cope with the contraction whilst also signaling to the person going through this experience with her what exactly she is going through.
That's not the intent of women. The intent of women is not to signal to the man what she's going through.
But that's what you just said, right? Is that the man couldn't tell, the man and the woman were seeing 2 different things in terms of a contraction.
They were seeing different things, but when women are choosing effective ways of breathing, they're not thinking in their mind, this is how I'm going to explain.
No, of course not. Of course not. But what I'm asking is that a positive effect of this? Is that not only is it serving the women, it's also helping the part, I'm just going to call it the partner, because of course, there are many relationships that have children. So for the sake of, I'm going to call it a partner, can understand how to best serve that woman in her experience as well. Is that another positive effect of the skills of birth breathing?
Yes, and that's sort of like a bit. Let me finish with this part, and then I'll get to that part. Okay, all right. Because so let's talk about women first, then we'll talk about the partner. So first of all, as women, we had to, or what Birthing Better, what our skills tell people, these are the 4 ways to breathe. Figure out the variations, or here's some exercises to figure out the variations of all of these. Which of the variations would help you cope if you were experiencing something that you didn't like, were unpleasant, it was hard to manage. And so women come up with nose breathing, and you never know in labor what you're going to do, right? And then nose in the nose, out the mouth breathing, with the most relaxation as possible, with a variation in what that sounds like. So particularly when you're nose breathing, the most variation it gets is either faster, which most women do not do, but it's mostly deeper. Right. But once they can't do that anymore, it naturally goes in, and that's like exercise. Right? Yeah. The nose breathing, you begin, the demand on your body, the metabolic need on your body increases. Women are sitting absolutely still, lying, standing. They're not doing anything that looks like they're having a metabolic need, but their body is having this increased pain. Yeah. And that becomes a metabolic need. Of course. Right? So they then switch over to in the nose, out the mouth, which then can begin to sound like relaxed at first, and women can stay that way throughout those 5 phases. Or if they can't stay that way, then they start to go into, and as it gets more intense, and as it gets more intense, as it gets more intense, right? And then as it begins to peak, it sounds like that. And then as it goes away, it begins to go, relief. Right, and then it can go back to nose breathing, right? So that's what women are doing. So what we discovered with Birthing Better and the skills that we have was that women have this choice of how they inhale and how they exhale that helps them feel, and we use lots of words: cope, manage, deal with, handle, work through, stay on top of, feel in control. Now, what happens when women don't feel in control? Okay, the contraction starts, and they may still nose breathe, and then as the pain goes up, then they start to go,
panic, constriction.
Right. So then they switch from in the nose, out the nose, to in and out the in the nose, out the in the mouth. They tense up because it hurts, and then when it goes away, right. So it sounds like that. So what we learned with thousands and thousands, since for 50 years of people using Birthing Better, is that women come back and they will say, when people, this is how they phrase it, when people talk about choice in childbirth, it really comes down in birth to how you breathe in and how you breathe out. Wow. Right? Which then brings us to, this brings us to that's the Oxygen Advantage and the Buteyko, is modifying your breathing to fit the metabolic need that you're experiencing, right?
To serve your own body and your own experience, I suppose.
Purpose, which we call it coping, managing, dealing with, working through, staying on top of. So what men are hearing is that moment-to-moment variation, right? So if they have the skills, we're all humans, so we all have the same experience before we breathe, and we all experience the same how to use those variations. They're the same, right? So when a man is birth coaching, or if somebody else is birth coaching, we have a birth coach with us, they begin to hear how we move from or to And that can be instantaneously because the intensity can go up. So when the other person, the birth coach, it really understands their role, which is to help her to cope and manage, men were very clever about it. People would say, how do you, what do you do if a woman freaks out in birth, right? She loses the plot. And the fathers who learned these skills said, don't let her do that. Don't let her get to that point. Right. So what men realized was as soon as a woman started squeaking, moaning, groaning, that's when you go and you model the breathing that can help her stay in control. Women don't want to be out of control. So if a woman is going, ah, and he hears or sees that, and he goes, she'll breathe with him and do that and regain her control.